Hear me okay? Is this technology working? All right, so I am fighting for about the 11th day of cold, so I don't think I'm contagious, but I'm a bit, the rest of it. So bear with me. But it's great to be here, and thanks so much, Colin, and to the department for having me here, even on Patriots Day weekend. I actually lived 4 years in high school, or junior high school in Concord, Massachusetts, way back when, and know about Patriot fever, goes back a long way. It's a really important time, I think, to talk about democracy, to talk about elections, to talk about how we might change them. And I think for pretty obvious reasons. It's on a lot of people's minds. It's not just about the 2016 election. It is for some people, but it really, I think, we are in a time and an era where this kind of conversation that FairVote has been part of is really one that I think more and more of the nation is having a focus on. It sort of has a history in this country of happening in these sort of spurts of time. If you look at, say, when we've changed the Constitution, it generally happens in sort of particular eras. We actually haven't been in an era of changing the Constitution in quite some time, and actually what I'm going to talk about today doesn't require changing the Constitution, but it does get down to first principles. But if you look back, like there was a spurt of amendments in the 60s, and then right around the time of World War I, and right after the Civil War, and there's sort of then gaps where sort of nothing happens, and we do our business, and the system's working. But I think for a lot of us, and really the practitioners themselves, government and politics isn't working very well. You're sort of seeing a wave of retirements in Congress right now, and from people actually in the majority party, but sort of frustrating. It's sort of hard to get things done. It's hard to do the nation's business. And it's very easy, as Colin said earlier, to zero in on personalities, to zero in on people, and to say, well, if things aren't working, just frustrated with these people. Maybe we can get new people, or really like ask people to be different. But here's the thing, of course, that people are always working within a system. They're working with institutions. And there are incentives that are created by the rules that we have established. And that's an important part of this, that we have established rules. We have rules right now, but a lot of people think, well, because we've had these rules governing elections, governing government, that it must go back to James Madison, coming down with tablets and saying, no, thou shalt have an electoral college done this way, and thou shalt elect Congress that way, and so on. And it's not true. The Constitution essentially is silent on electoral methods. It's actually a very insightful lack of content, because what it means is they're saying this is something that we all have to keep figuring out for ourselves. And if you put it in the Constitution, it's actually really hard to change things in the Constitution. And it's a sort of an act of hubris almost to say, we know how we are going to hold elections for a long, long time. But we act as if we can't change them. And we get frustrated at the people, and we actually don't have enough conversations about those rules when things aren't working out. But it's very easy to see that rules matter. I often use different examples of that, but when I was young, I really was a good little basketball player and had dreams of what that might mean for me. And even if I was 6'7", I probably would not have risen to being a great basketball player. But without being 6'7", there's like no way I'm going to be a great basketball player, right? And part of it is rules. Like if they made the court 3 times bigger and maybe had like little baskets off on the side that quick, speedy little people could go get to, someone who's 5'11" could actually play, right, at a high level. But we don't. We have certain rules and certain things, and then like your median basketball player is a much taller than the median person in the United States, and it's just because of the rules that create certain incentives for who can be good at things. It works fine for basketball, but we want for politics and elections, I think, to have a system where we all can participate no matter what our height is or what our where we live. And I think also what we think. I mean, we all should have a chance to participate, have a meaningful way to vote. And I think when we accept rules that make that really hard, that's always a problem. And so I started with others to get FairVote going in '92 with a set of concerns about our democracy that I still have, which involve whole important perspectives not really being able to participate fully and have represented in government. And you might sort of think about yourselves or people you know, are there certain combinations of views that you might have that doesn't feel like almost anyone in Congress has? You know, you might have pieces of them. Obviously, you might someone, I just love what they say about this. But they also have some other view I don't like or something, right? And there are sort of whole big groups of categories of people that can feel pretty left out of our system. I can feel that some of the most important issues we need to talk about are challenging to talk about in our current rules because they're hard to win majorities with. And often, you know, the things we need to talk about that are most important and challenging are ones that are trying to catch problems before they're bigger problems. But because they're not bigger problems, most people might not be ready to hear them yet. And some people are saying, watch out, you know, this is going to be a big problem. And you know, it's hard for a politician to actually be very far ahead of the curve when you need, and why? Why is that? Because of certain rules, and we're going to get into kind of what those rules are. We look at politics today, and there's a certain things going on, and you can say, gosh, it's, you know, why are they doing this? So one thing that we're starting to see more and more of is that big acts of legislation, like the tax law that just passed, right, are passing on just partisan votes. That's actually not common in American history. We had generally passed big bills where there's been some accommodation, some way to get it through with votes where it actually became not a completely bipartisan vote, but you know, relatively substantial sort of supermajority votes. We have an interesting setup that's unusual in international norms. And by the way, if my voice sort of starts fading and you can't hear me or something, just wave your hand and I can figure this mic out better or something. But we don't have a parliamentary system, right? So a parliamentary system like Canada has, United Kingdom, many countries, there's no separately elected president. They often don't really have a house, an upper house, like a Senate, that has very much power. So you elect the main House of Representatives, often a parliament, and the government, the prime minister, comes out of that and makes decisions like in a more unitary fashion, right? It's sort of like they don't get checks and balances. Because we have checks and balances, we have a president and we have a Senate and we have a House. You often need supermajorities, like the filibuster rule in the Senate. We have a lot of ways that it forces the parties to try to do things together. And that's something that actually goes back to the philosophy of James Madison and the other founders. But we're really pushing that philosophy pretty far right now because the parties just have a heck of a hard time accommodating each other, right? And working across party lines. And so you're seeing even you know, in the Senate where you know, they serve 6-year terms and you have more senators that represent states that lean more toward the other party, but still you're seeing these really sharp party line votes. Now, if you think about why that might be happening, it actually has an electoral connection, electoral rule connection. And so in our current rules, pretty much in every state, every senator, every U.S. House member, when it comes time for their reelection, has a primary. Like they have to be nominated, right? And that group of people that participate in that election is not everyone, right? It's people of that party, and it's people who decide to turn out in that primary. Can I just have a show of hands? Who has voted in a non-presidential primary? Not a presidential primary, but a congressional primary. So we have a lot of participants in voting here. So congratulations to that. But you know, we are seeing more and more turnouts in those kinds of primaries that are like less than 15%, like really low participation in primaries. Not only that, the people who participate in primaries, and I'm not sure if it's people in this room, but it's often have are more sort of become more fiercely partisan than the people who might vote in a general election, because you know they're the kind of people that show up in primaries, and what they are getting more and more motivated by is they don't want to see their nominees, they don't want to see their party kind of accommodating and like working with the other party. Really, like people don't, because they don't like the other party. They're more against the other party than they used to be. And so you can imagine, like Democrats that said, like, I'm working with Donald Trump to pass something, and I want your vote, and I'm in a Democratic primary. That's not a great message. Just like it wasn't a great message for Republicans to say, I'm working with Barack Obama to try to come up with a good foreign policy, or whatever. They're not rewarded for that. In fact, they're punished for that. And we saw some big examples of that. So the idea of legislation being created in a more bipartisan way is now very difficult to do and still like feel you're going to be able to get through your primary. Now, one thing that's also true is, because of our electoral rules, is that we have general elections, people vote in November, where almost all of those elections are essentially decided by the results of the primary. Because in the general elections, again, in this fiercely partisan climate we now have today, it's very, very difficult to win in the other party's turf. Like in the 2014 US Senate races, that was the first time, I think in history, but at least a long, long time, where every Senate race went to a candidate who, of the same party, whose presidential nominee had won that state in 2012. Right? So they matched up exactly. And that meant Republicans picked up several seats, but basically it all matched up. But that's not just at that level. 2014 also, like Georgia, had state legislative races. They have a pretty big legislature, like more than 200 seats. There were 2 seats out of those 200 where the nominee was of a party that wasn't the same as the presidential candidate that carried that state legislative district in 2012. So imagine that, it's a state legislative race. They're like close to you. You're allegedly supposed to be able to get to know them as people. They might have their own personal stories. But if they were of the other party's brand, you probably didn't vote for them if you believed in the other party's brand, right? And it's just kind of like, and that branding can be measured by the presidential vote, but it carries all the way down to the state legislative level. Now, that doesn't happen across the board, but it's much, much more likely. So we do this report every couple years called Monopoly Politics, where we project winners in US House races. And we say, without using any data from the current election cycle, without knowing who's running, except whether the incumbent's running, we do factor that in. But we don't look at the challenger, we don't look at their personality, we don't look at how much money they're raising, we don't look at how much money the incumbent's raising. We don't look at their voting records. We can just look at their party, we can look at the district composition and the partisan results in that district in the last couple cycles. And we call almost 90% of US House races essentially as soon as we have the data that we need, which we'll have for the 2020 projections the day after the 2018 elections. We'll call the 2020 House races in about 90% of races. And we don't call them all because we're trying to be cautious, but we are cautious enough that of the last 1,000 plus that we've called, we missed 1. And that's making projections in that many races with a pretty simple methodology. It's not that we're amazing, it's that actually voters are pretty predictable. So what that means is if you're an incumbent in one of those 90% of the districts where it's pretty foreordained where you're going to win, right, where's the only place you might lose? Primary, right? You might lose a primary. You might lose within your own party. You're not going to lose to someone from the other party. You're not going to lose to a third party, an independent, because that really doesn't really happen in our system, and we can say a little bit more about that. So that means that they have to be particularly respectful and responsive to the primary electorate, which wants them to act in certain ways. And the way we want them to act in these primary elections actually then freaks people out from the other side more and more, and they just keep going farther and farther apart. It's like a vicious cycle. And when the 2020 presidential cycle comes around and the Democratic primaries are going to happen, You're going to see like who can be the more anti-Trump, who can be like the most over-the-top anti-Trump person, you know, like, and just like in 2016, it was who could be the most anti-Barack Obama person, right? And it's like that's, and why do they do that? It's like, why are they acting that way? Well, because that's what the primary voters want. So you can sort of blame the voters, you can blame the candidates, but you can also blame the rules that set things up that we're now operating in certain ways, and we're not looking at how they could be different. And that's sort of a big thing that sort of we're trying to say is that you can change these rules. The Constitution, in the sense they urged us to think about it. And early on, we did much more in exploration of differences. So, for instance, the Electoral College. Who's familiar with the Electoral College? Pretty much everyone. Okay, good. So, Electoral College picks the president. Now, the rule in almost every state, right, is whoever gets the most popular votes in that state gets all of that state's electoral votes, right? So it's a winner-take-all rule, meaning that if you win a state by one vote in the popular vote, you get all the electoral votes. If you win it by 40%, you also win in all of the electoral votes, but you don't win any more electoral votes, right? You just have to win it. So that is something we've come to believe is sort of the rule and accepted, and James Madison must have loved that. Actually, James Madison didn't like that system. He proposed a constitutional amendment to not allow that system because he was seeing how it was starting to operate. And we didn't do it for a long time. Here's one sort of interesting fact is that 1872 was the, after the Civil War, was the very first election, or the first selection of president, where every state had a popular vote to choose their electors. Up until then, at least one state didn't have a popular vote at all to pick their electors. And that was actually quite common early on. And then of those that did hold elections, one, of course, not that many people necessarily voted, right, because they had very different suffrage rules. But they also often didn't do a winner-take-all statewide rule. They explored, they did different things, and maybe by congressional district, or have a special electoral college choice selection. Massachusetts, I think, had 7 rules in 40 years. Now, they settled on winner-take-all. So you must say, well, that must have been like just the right thing to do. But if you think about it from a game theory perspective, what they were doing was settling on something that they almost had to, because as the game became more partisan, it did become partisan quite quickly, right? The factions were defined early on, Hamilton versus Jefferson, and these kinds of partisan groupings. And if you didn't give your maximum number of electoral votes to your side in your state, but you had some system that might say split your electoral votes, and the other side maxed out on giving all their electoral votes to one side, you were losing out, right? You were not playing the game very smartly. So the incentive for every state was to max out for their candidate. But collectively, it's insane. I mean, if you step back and look at the presidential election cycle, like Rhode Island's a good example. Rhode Island is totally going to be won by a Democrat in 2020, right? Just as it has for years and years and years. Actually, there's 34 states. So what? We have 50 states overall, right, in D.C. There's 34 where there has not been a general election campaign event where a candidate has gone to the event for president or vice president with one of the major parties and done an event to try to garner support and votes after the conventions since 2004, right? So there's like 3 whole cycles where they've got not a single event. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton and her running mate, Tim Kaine, did more than 1/4 of their campaign events in 2016 in which one state? Can people name that one state? Someone can guess. That's a good guess, because it often has been Ohio. It was Florida. So her campaign's perception was, we've got this blue wall that we can't lose. Like states like Michigan and Wisconsin. Those are in our camp, right? So if we just win Florida, And you add that to the blue wall. The blue wall were states that they had won, the Democrats had won in every state since 1992. So if they just keep winning those states, win Florida. So they said, okay, let's really go to Florida. So one, they lost Florida. That wasn't a great strategy. And then two, they obviously didn't quite have the blue wall they thought, and they lost a couple states. But Michigan and Wisconsin, to show what it meant to think that they were safe, they had often been won by only 3 or 4 or 5 percentage points. A state becomes safe from a campaign perspective, even when it gets like 55, 45, it's like, totally safe. Like North Carolina and South Carolina are right next to each other. In 2007, or start of 2008, Barack Obama won the South Carolina primary. It was a really important primary for him. It was one of the early contests. He had just lost in New Hampshire to Clinton. And this was sort of righting his ship as they went into like this big Super Tuesday vote, which was happening in a couple weeks where all these states were voting at the same time. And if he had sort of lost again, it would have been bad for him. But he won South Carolina, and that was in January 2008. He didn't step foot in South Carolina again until almost the end of his presidency, like 8 years later. Because in the general election in South Carolina, he lost by like 10 percentage points, 55 to 45. So his campaign calculated 55, 45, I can't overcome that. It's not really a point for me to travel there as president. It's really not a point to campaign there. North Carolina, so we got 45% or 44% or something in South Carolina. He got 49% in North Carolina, but that was like pretty much dead even in 2008. So then in his first term, he was in North Carolina 19 times in just his first four years to do different kind of campaign events, and held the party convention there in 2012. So just that difference between 45 and 49. So the reason why I say the winner-take-all rule collectively is insane is it sort of drives this weird behavior where some states are in and some states are not because they're better, but because they happen to be in this sliver of states that are competitive and their campaign behavior can affect outcomes. But if we want a country where like the candidates are like learning from all the voters and they're like reaching out to all the votes, I would say you should have a system that rewards campaigning in all the states, right? And we can do that, and that's sort of one of the proposals we've put out there called the National Popular Vote Plan for President, which is a state-based plan, which Rhode Island has passed, and Massachusetts has passed, and my state of Maryland has passed. A number of states have passed. But the way the law works, it won't kick in until the number of states that have collectively passed it have a majority electoral college. There's a whole thing we could get into Q&A if you're interested in hearing more about that. But that's a rule that can be changed. Doesn't need to change the Constitution. It's a state law change. If we changed it overnight, those 34 states that don't get any campaign attention would all get attention. And if we think that's a good thing, we can change the rule. If we don't think it's a good thing, then we won't. But so then there's other things that we have the right to change. I talked about all those safe seats for Congress. The idea of one person per representative or one district per representative is not in the Constitution. And in fact, again, that founding generation, the first decades of the country, a number of states had actually statewide elections for U.S. House. I live in a state where we do have single-member districts for Congress, but in my state legislature, I have 3 representatives rather than 1 in my House district. I have a senator and then 3 House members. And in fact, in the 50s, as recently as the 50s, more than 40 states had multi-member districts where you had more than 1 representative. Then there was sort of a push towards single-member districts. There's reasons for that. But we think that was a very sort of limiting decision. It means, one, you only have 1 person representing you. You're carving up the country in these little units. And yes, you get geographic representation. That's good. But that's the only thing you're guaranteed on. So we have a quota for where you live, but what you think and how you want to mobilize and how other things that you matter, there's no quota, of course, but there's really no way to often change a lot of this representation, to the point that, as I said, Georgia was that locked up, but Georgia's not alone. There are whole chambers where the districts map up, just with the presidential vote, and U.S. House races too. So there's a bill, and you got this little piece of literature. I had a piece in the New York Times about this, and there's a bill in Congress. It's not going to pass this Congress, but it could. It's a statute, and what it would do is change single-member districts to bigger districts where you'd have more than one representative. A state like Rhode Island would just be at large. Connecticut would be at large. Massachusetts might have, say, 3 districts of 3 or a 5 and 4 seat district. So you'd have bigger districts, and then you'd use a different electoral rule that would not be winner take all. So winner take all means whoever gets the most wins all, right? And you hear that term in our politics some, mostly, we hear it outside of politics, like a winner take all economy, or pro basketball players make tons of money and college basketball players don't make any, or something, right? It's sort of like a winner take all society. But we also see it in, say, presidential primaries. Like the Republicans will sometimes have a winner-take-all primary, and whoever wins the most votes in that primary gets all of the delegates. They say, well, it's really important to win because you get it all if you win. Democrats actually don't allow winner-take-all primaries. They do proportional allocation in a primary. So if the vote in a state is like 45 to 30 to 20 or something like that, they allocate convention delegates in that proportion. So you can actually there's rules that would allow that in congressional races, and we actually like these sort of candidate-based approaches where you're voting for people, but you can sort of provide fair representation. So if a district has 5 seats, and there's a political force that mobilizes and runs candidates and wins 52% of the vote, that's a majority. In a winner-take-all, they'd win all 5 seats. In a fair representation system, they would win 3 out of 5. And then the rest of the voters would win too. Sort of a fair reflection of people. And if we did that for Congress, so the proposal we have there, we've actually gamed it out. We've done simulations of it, and it's really straightforward to create districts, never creating a district with more than 5 representatives where there's not a single one-party multi-member district in the country. Both parties would have access to organize and mobilize, participate, and help elect someone. When a party wins more than 1 seat, they would not get kind of a monochrome, similar rubber stamps of each other, right? Because there'd be some of the differences we have within the parties would also be better represented. And we think that we really would need something like, that would be great value. When you think about incentives, think about having members of Congress who all shared constituents with someone of another party. And sometimes they're doing legislation that really is good for their district, and they would likely want to develop it with other people who represent their district, even if of another party. You'd also mean when they divide it off in their caucuses, they'd actually keep the whole country in the room, because there'd be Republicans representing New York City and Democrats representing rural Oklahoma and so on, and they'd be sort of thinking about the country as a whole. And we wouldn't necessarily be stuck with just 2-party choices. And that's something that basically no other country at this point of any note really keeps only having 2 parties representing their population. And I think that kind of binary thinking of zero-sum, you're either this or that, is really not reflective of who we are as a country and how young people tend to be. I think, I'll be interested to hear your perception, but I got 3 people, three children who are 19 to 23, and I don't know, they're not binary-ish, right? They're sort of complex in their thinking, and they're not sort of easy to lump into one way or the other. Certainly young people are registering to vote much more and more as independent. Not that they're necessarily not aligned more with one party or the other, but they don't want to be stuck in a box, right? Let me think for myself. And we need a system that allows people to think for themselves and allow differences to express it. And we can work on this stuff. We can do this and see if we like it. But I think it's really would be insane not just to stick with the rules that keep creating the conditions that we see. And I think I'll get into the sort of last idea, which is actually the idea that we work on the most. They're now tucking at the end, but is an example of a very specific change that's happening in the country that we think would be sort of a straightforward, simple change that would really transform the way we vote. So how many of you have heard of the idea of a ranked choice vote system or instant runoff voting? Great. So that's an idea. It's actually, there's legislation in Rhode Island to do this. But right now, as we're talking here, up in Maine, there is a big rally going on. And the reason why they're having a big rally is they're celebrating having turned in a whole bunch of signatures today, that will trigger a referendum. They call it a people's veto. So Maine's interesting. They have the right of initiative in Maine, meaning that if you want to put an idea to the voters and maybe get it into policy, you have the right to talk to your fellow citizens around a particular proposal, have them sign it, and if a certain number of people sign it, you can put it on the ballot and people can decide whether to make that the law. So they did that with ranked choice voting in 2016, and it passed, second highest vote total actually of any initiative in Maine history. 2017, the legislature sort of fought over it. They needed to fund it. There was a legal ruling that affected certain parts of it, and they ultimately basically delayed the whole package. And they did this. There were actually 4 initiatives that passed in 2016, and every single one of them they either repealed or majorly changed. And they suddenly said, okay, the voters have advised us what to do, but we're going to do whatever we want to do. And it's really created a pretty outraged a group of people in Maine. And they're channeling that energy through the ranked choice voting one. And so it'll be on the ballot in June to restore ranked choice voting. And because the people's veto vote is taking place, the ranked choice voting law actually gets back in place and will be used for the primaries. So what am I talking about? Before I sort of say a little more about it, why don't I show this video if I can? Did it go to sleep? You saw the mayor of Minneapolis here. Okay, let's see if I can master my technology. Come on, Jason, start talking. Someone know how to hit return? There we go. Okay, so this is Minneapolis, and these are candidates 2 days after the election, both winners and losing, talking about what ranked choice voting meant in their election. Oh, we lost them. You can see a headline, applaud positive campaigns and high voter turnout.
Is democracy at its finest.
Well, if it doesn't work, we can still talk about it.
Good idea.
Okay, well, I will paraphrase.
We have an activist engaged.
Here we go. Oh, tantalizing. Okay, that's okay. You can Google it and find it later. So I was going to sort of show what it does to politics before kind of getting wonky about how it works. But I'll paraphrase here. Here. Minneapolis had this race for mayor. St. Paul, its neighboring city, did too. This is used in 13 cities now. It's being used next in Santa Fe in March, San Francisco in June. Sorry, let me just get this cough out of my way. Gracious. There's more than 2 people running, right? In fact, there were about 11, maybe, I think even more like 15. There were sort of like maybe 7 strong candidates who ran in Minneapolis. St. Paul had 10 and maybe like 4 who were particularly strong, right? It's used in various other places. Australia uses ranked choice voting, has actually done it for 100 years. In their congressional races, which also happen with 1 representative, they have an average of 7 people that runs, right? So there's sort of more choices. Now, if you have more choices without ranked choice voting, what's the thing you start thinking about, right? The person might win, but not necessarily win with half the votes. In fact, they could win with a pretty low share of the votes. And this whole debate, how many of you, it sounds like a lot of you have been voting, have ever sort of been in a situation where you say, well, the person I'd like, I don't think can win, and if I vote for that person, it might help someone win who I don't like, right? So some of you. It's actually, anytime you start thinking about third parties and independents in our system, that's generally the place you get into. Sometimes independents and third parties can actually get up and win. You had an independent get elected governor of Rhode Island in 2010. There's an independent senator in Maine, but they're super rare, right? It's really, really hard in our system because if you think about our system, if you need to get the most votes to win and you start off in third or fourth, it's like, you don't win anything until you win it all. And before that time, you're winning votes and people are saying you're taking votes away from someone else who can win and you're a spoiler, you're splitting the vote. So there's this whole debate that happens whenever you have more than two choices of like, you can't really vote for the person you want. If you do, you're being stupid. Why is that person even running? And that's it sort of curtails choice. So what Minneapolis has is a system. They used to vote in 2 different rounds, vote in the first round, and they'd have a runoff between the top 2. But not that many people voted in the first round. And so by the time that most people were voting, there were only 2 people, right? So it was only 2 voices in sort of this binary politics. So now they have a system where you can have more of the choices just right on the ballot. And what that means is the candidates, and then what you do as a voter is you don't just vote for one person. You get to vote for one person, but then you get to vote for a second person. That's my second choice. It's ranked choice voting because you're saying, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, here's my third choice. And the way the count goes is that the ballots count all in for your first choice and only your first choice. And you add up all the first choices. And if someone has won more than half the votes, you've got a winner, right? They've got more than 50%. No one else can beat them. But if no one has 50%, then the candidate who is in last place is knocked out. Or last place, sorry. You look at their ballots and you add their second choices in because their favorite is no longer in the race. Everyone else's favorite is still in the race. And you add those second choices in, then you keep going until someone wins more than half the votes. And that's how the system works. And essentially, it's very liberating for a voter. You say, well, my favorite, maybe they win, maybe they can win, they can't win, but I want to express my vote for them, and I will. And if they lose, then my ballot goes to my second choice. So all that whole debate about third parties and independents being split votes and spoilers, it all goes away. And then you can have a campaign of more about ideas. You also have a situation where candidates now have to think about supporters of other people's candidates, of people who support other candidates, but might be an important second or third choice for them. So right now in Santa Fe, they're using it for the first time for mayor. And if you kind of Google about ranked choice voting in Santa Fe or something, the candidates are all talking to all the voters, right? And saying, well, if there's yard signs for the other candidates, that's okay. Knock on the door, try to start a debate and dialogue, persuade them you're a good candidate, and maybe you can get a second or third choice. Maybe you can even persuade them to make your first choice, but just that extension of the dialogue. And it's all tied to a different rule that creates different incentives for behavior. So what this video kind of runs through, both winners and losers, talking about what that meant for them in Minneapolis. Turnout did really surge in Minneapolis. It doesn't always surge in ranked choice voting elections, but I think the more that candidates learn how to run ranked choice voting campaigns well, the more the turnout will keep going up because it's really promoting a different kind of engagement. When you think back to some of our recent elections, the Republican presidential primaries were a great example of a very divided field. Actually, the first primary one with more than half the votes was late in April in New York when Trump won a majority there. But up until that time, all the states were won with less than 50 and many with less than 35. And it promotes a certain kind of campaign style when you don't need to kind of be a consensus kind of winner. Democrats are going to have a big field running in 2020 and going to have kind of a duplicate kind of pattern there. Even though they allocate their delegates proportionally, the media is going to focus on who's winning a state, and those states are going to be won with 25, 27%. And they could use a ranked choice system that kind of encourages the candidates to have to reach out to more people. And in general elections, Michael Bloomberg at one point was thinking that he might run, but the whole debate was like, well, you'll split the vote. You'll change history not by what you're doing, but by what you're causing people to do with splitting their vote. Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, both sort of interesting candidates, Green Party and the Libertarian candidate, got votes, but a whole lot of the debate was who are they splitting the vote from, and several key states were not won with a majority, and so they did have an impact on the race, but also the atmosphere about their candidacies becomes much more negative, and that's tied to a system where we put them in this box where third parties are really not supposed to run, but of course people sometimes want to run and want to put their ideas forward. And I think we have a weird politics that doesn't allow that to happen. And that can be changed by statute. So Maine has done it. We'll see how it works in June for these contests. We're seeing it in cities. We're working through some of the vote counting logistics, but I think as that kind of gets better and better handled, we can sort of do this for many of our elections. And what we get from that is an ability to have kind of a more nuanced range of choice, different incentives for the candidates to reach out to people. You can sort of go through a set of electoral rules that we have and hold them up to the light and say, is this working, right? And this is actually what you're supposed to do, what we're supposed to do, to say, are we getting what we want? Can we change it? And not just sort of accept the rules as they are. And I think we're starting to do that. And groups like FairVote, I don't know, did Christina Mora get here from Common Cause? Hey, Christina. There's a Common Cause, Rhode Island is a terrific group right here in Rhode Island that's working on these voting issues. Christina used to do some work for us as well. But there is a conversation that has to happen in this country. And I think that's sort of what I'll maybe leave you with, which is that I don't think our system is self-correcting right now. I think it's sort of gotten into a cycle that's really problematic and reinforcing into patterns that are really leading to the kind of dysfunction, polarization, sort of divides, and really not just addressing problems in a sensible, collaborative way that kind of gets to solutions that service the country. And when our political system is sort of producing those kinds of results, I think it's really incumbent on us to have the conversation. And again, that's what our founding fathers and mothers and sisters wanted us to do. And I think it's sort of up to us to sort of step in and do that. So I will be anxious and eager to hear what you all think about this and answer any questions you might have about specific proposals or some of the general ideas I've been talking about. So thank you.
Hello. We take the first recorded question from a student.
Thank you. What I wanted to ask about is, I think, a common critique or a question about ranked choice voting is, for example, in my own community, proposed ranked choice voting, and one of the most common critiques was that there'd be too many candidates running and too many choices for voters, so they'd be overwhelmed. So what do you think about that issue, and how do you think it can be addressed, or is it not really an issue?
Yeah. So, well, it's interesting. Minneapolis, actually, the first big election for mayor, they had like really easy ballot access rules. I think it's like you had to pay like $30 and you could be on the ballot or something. They had 35 candidates run. And there was a belief that, well, that's maybe more than you should have. Now, you could get that in the old system too, right? But if you only have one round to sort it out, that's sort of a bigger number of races. So they raised the threshold of you could still get on by signature, but if you wanted to do it by money, I think you had to put like $500 in. So it was sort of a greater level of investment, but you could still get on without paying anything if you got a certain number of signatures. So candidate and ballot access is something that we can control. How many of you are Massachusetts voters? Oh, a lot of you. So your state is actually the absolute worst state for being able to get on the primary ballot. You don't even think about, it's really hard for third parties and independents to often get on the ballot, but to get on the primary ballot in Massachusetts, you can only get signatures from your party's registered voters. So Republicans are in the minority in Massachusetts, and they have to kind of run around and kind of like find Republicans to sign their petitions, and you sort of go up to someone and say, "Are you a Republican?" You know, like it's this awkward conversation. And so there's more uncontested races in Massachusetts for Congress and state legislature on average than any other state in the country, and it's because of these like terrible ballot access rules that get almost no conversation, because it's not like the Republicans would be winning these races if they got on, but they at least would be sort of presenting a choice. So anyway, you can have really bad ballot access laws. You can have sort of like maybe too lenient ballot access laws and then something in the middle. But I think that what we've experienced, and I think the races that I was talking about from St. Paul and Minneapolis, is that voters are actually more open to having more choices than we might think, right? It's like it's not that they're actually saying, my goodness, you know, help me from having, you know, more options. I think in general our society is moving to one, being a multiple option society. Certainly when I grew up, there was like 3 major television networks and PBS and some UHF channel or something like that. We had 5 things, and that was like seemed like a lot or something. But you know, that's not what we get today, right? And you know, the hunger is for kind of more. And I think that what we just need is a system that kind of accommodates that. But the having more choices, having a system that accommodates this, don't necessarily have to, you know, like you can calibrate your number of choices really in other ways than with ranked choice voting. So I think ranked choice voting is just a good tool to have it.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, obviously the states that we would want this sort of the ranked choice voting are the ones that are majority one party, but what incentive is there for those states to actually pass that sort of legislation?
Yeah. Well, so there's different ideas I put out there. So I think ranked choice voting as passed in Maine is really a logical idea across the board, right? It's interesting in Maine, it's become a bit partisan because the current governor won his first governor's race with like 37%, and everyone knows he probably wouldn't have won with ranked choice voting. He won his first primary for governor with 39%. He might not have won that primary. He won his first mayoral election with 35%. He might not have been elected mayor. So he's a guy who's like a plurality guy, not really a majority guy. And so people who like him are like, well, I don't like this system that seems like anti-my guy. But it's really not the reason why Maine has done this. Maine actually has a whole history of like, you know, 9 of their last 11 elections for governor going back 4 decades have not been won with a majority. But it can kind of get a little tribal in how people react to it at the time. But that's all to say, so we're working with Democrats and Republicans quite closely in a number of different states. And it seems like the divide is not, am I in the majority or not, but am I willing to embrace and open to change or not? And you can actually find kind of that cuts across the divide. It's almost sort of like an attitude. But the fair representation idea, multi-member districts, and allowing those in the minority to win, that's a little more challenging for the majority to do. Almost every other country has done that, right? So that's an interesting thing to look at, that we are very isolated in international norms for having a winner-take-all rule. Colin was in Germany, and Germany has like an example of a system where about half of the people get elected in the same way we have them in single-member districts, and then half come in by a party vote that reflects people's overall partisan preference. And that system sort of, you know, some people say, well, it does the best of both worlds. You get like your local representative and you get overall fairness. You know, different countries have worked it out in different ways. But there's always, of course, a point in time when a party that is in control, having been elected under the rules of the old game, has to sort of embrace something new. And it generally takes somewhat of a crisis dynamic. And that's our question. How close are we getting to a crisis dynamic that everyone begins to see that way? And we're not there right now, I think, frankly. But I'm sad to say I think we may be heading more that way. And then that conversation about multi-member districts, I think, becomes a more and more serious one. But I think ranked choice voting, the main barrier to it is a perception of novelty and sort of administrative issues. And as we get it used in more places, the novelty goes away. as the administrative issues get removed, which are, that kind of goes away. And I can see this really spreading very, very broadly and quickly. Not quickly maybe, but sort of in political reform terms relatively quickly. Yes. Oh, sorry, Alan. Yeah, and I just pointed to a hand. So if there's a flow.
I'll bring this over to you
Yeah.
so you can ask the next question. Thanks for being here, and this is really exciting. I think we are at that crisis point, or just about at the crisis point, but because our democracy and our system is so dysfunctional, I don't know that the system itself could come up with solutions like this. I'm curious if there could be a judicial decision. Like, so if this, like a lot of the gerrymandering cases, could Justice Kennedy have gone to one of your lectures and say, oh, well, this would be a nice way to implement a solution to some of the problems with gerrymandering we're having? Could a judicial branch implement some of these solutions?
That's a good question, an interesting one. So does everyone's familiar with the idea of gerrymandering, I assume, right? So gerrymandering is when we have these single-member districts that we're all represented by in Congress, but the district lines aren't, decreed by some divine power. They are created by a very real political power, generally by politicians drawing districts that they, for whatever reason, would like to see that way. It's usually a pretty partisan reason, and particularly if one party really runs it, they can just kind of like draw the districts they want. They help their friends, they hurt their enemies. Very basic Platonic justice. And it's problematic, and it's gotten worse and worse because we're so partisan. You can really govern results more and more, and the technology for knowing how voters are going to vote has gotten better and better. It's just really gotten, like, it's crossed a certain point of problematic nature. So the judges are, the courts are like saying, you know what, this is going to be a problem. Pennsylvania, under its state constitution, just threw out its U.S. congressional district map, which is one that Republicans have 13 seats out of 19, and they won that many even when they lost, they didn't win half the votes in House races in 2012. So you can really get these very distortions in outcomes, lots of safe seats. So there's a case that's up before the Supreme Court from a Wisconsin state legislative situation, which is kind of like the Pennsylvania one, and it's going to be really interesting to see what they do, but there's a belief that they are going to take some action to try to curb at least partisan gerrymandering. By that meaning one party really trying to get a particular edge over another. My state of Maryland also has a case up there which is actually more based on a personal case. It's a Republican. Maryland's run by Democrats. They carved their districts to win 7 out of 8 seats in Congress in a state that is majority Democratic, but it's not 85% Democratic, and they really have gerrymandered it. And this is a Republican who's saying, like, because of who used to be represented by a Republican, and then he got kind of drawn into a different district and says, it's because of my views I was targeted. And it's like, it's almost like a right of association kind of case. It's an interesting one too. So we'll see what the court does. We get in our system, the court does try to solve our big problems sometimes, and issues of race are classic examples of that, where we had a great problem figuring out how to solve issues of race in our country through the political process and segregation in the South. So the court finally, stepped in with Brown v. Board of Education. And I think it is, by the way, an indication of failure of our political process that we have trouble sometimes dealing with really big things. That's not a great sign that we have to let courts do it. But the courts can only go so far. So yeah, you're right. It would be great if their remedy, because the remedy they're going to say will define how to do partisan gerrymandering to avoid a lawsuit. So, because they have to create some standard that the legislators know they can be on the right side of the fence and not get their plan thrown out. So it has to be a very clear standard, and it will still allow a lot of partisan gerrymandering, right? It's just trying to define it as to limit it. And they can still protect all the incumbents. That's not on the table that they're trying to fix. So, we can have lots of safe seats. That's okay. There's only so much you can do with a gerrymandering fix. But what my dream would be, and actually we have a brief before the Supreme Court, an amicus brief, making this case. Hey, if the Supreme Court wants to not have the court system regularly have to litigate and figure out or kind of like adjudicate, I guess the word is, these highly political decisions, because any decision they make of drawing district lines has immediate partisan implications that you can usually know, and you're putting the courts in this position of essentially making partisan, changing partisan outcomes. If you don't want to do that, turn it over to the voters, right? Multi-member districts, ranked choice voting, you can get out of the picture and let the voters decide. That's a remedy that would be neutral for you, great for voters, good for the country. I don't think they're ready to do that, but maybe, maybe they can get to a point as we keep struggling with the issue and as we keep talking about the issue and highlighting the problem, maybe we can get to a point that they would step in. But I also think there are ways that our political process can get to solutions sometimes when it gets to a certain level of crisis. So, maybe one or the other, or maybe somehow in a tandem, that'll work. Okay, yes?
Lots of Americans, including myself, believe the last presidential election was a disaster, and a disaster that occurred before voting day. What? Oh, okay. I'll just give you in institutional, not in issue terms, what I think happened. Clinton was far too much the establishment candidate. She proceeded with a sense of entitlement in an atmosphere where elites were, I believe justly, but I don't need that, discredited. Whereas Trump was far too much an anti-establishment candidate to the point of irresponsibility. Now, you don't have to agree with my analysis of that, but but if something like that is true, do your proposal speak to it?
Well, so here's one way to think about it. So we've got a country of what, 300 and, what's it up to? 320 million, something like that. Were those the two very best candidates we ever could have had running for president in 2016? Probably some people would say maybe not. There had been a primary process with a lot more candidates and things, and there were minor party candidates on the ballot too. Can't forget them. But we have a system that lends itself to extreme limitations of choice, and candidates who've survived nomination processes where primary electorates are creating certain kinds of nominees, and then that's what the bigger general election electorate is stuck with. And because we don't have ranked choice voting, or at least a runoff election, or some system that accommodates more than two choices, that's what we get, right? It's our fault, right? It's our fault for leaving that system in place. And so I think the way I think ranked choice voting would speak to that is if we had ranked choice voting in place, I don't think we would have only had those two choices. Your question was, well, is there too many choices? I think there'd be more than two is okay, right? Do we want 50? No, but do we want something where there's sort of like a credible number of choices that allows us more nuance and a greater ability for the best to rise to the top, and the candidate who figures out how to build a consensus wins. I think that's it really is on us that we keep this system in place, because we don't have to. It's a simple statute to change it. Rhode Island could change. Rhode Island, there's a debate in Rhode Island about whether we need to change the constitution of the Rhode Island state constitution to use ranked choice voting for governor. I actually happen to think it doesn't need a state constitutional amendment. Maybe it does. But it doesn't need anything like that to change it for presidential elections or for U.S. Senate and U.S. House races. It's just a simple statute. And so, Rhode Island could do it.
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm interested that you seem to be measuring success or things in favor of this system. We get more representation of people of color and of women, which seems based on a kind of idea of identity politics, which I'm very uncomfortable with. But especially I want to raise the question about women. A woman isn't necessarily better represented by a woman. And women differ in class and religion in very, very deep ways. And I think those women who choose to go into politics actively are skewed in the direction of being highly elite, probably have very few children, are ambitious, glass ceiling types like Hillary, and women whose lives center more on family don't get involved in politics except voting. And since one of my main concerns is the pro-life issue, I think that this distorts the idea that women represent women is bad for us that way. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, I think I'm sure a lot of people might agree with a lot of that. But here's what I would say. Some countries have actual like rigid quotas. It's a very interesting decision to make in thou shalt have a certain share of seats that are women and men. Sometimes they just create incentives to change it. But here's, I think, if you step back for a minute, there's not a single state legislature in the country where women make up half. If it was sort of random, I'd kind of be more with you, right? If it's like, yeah, Rhode Island happens to be one of those states where it's 75% women and men are 25%. It's like, yeah, doesn't really matter about the gender, so sometimes you get 75% women, sometimes you get 75% men. But of course, it's never that way, right? It's only one way. And when you see something like a pattern like that, where there's a whole half of the country, which in every single state is like way underrepresented in proportion to their numbers, it says something about how inviting the system is to kind of a fair reflection of people. Maybe some people disagree, but the general pattern is that we're seeing more and more, kind of a growth of men and women. But I think that it's the fair representation proposal that's more likely to elect more women. And here's a basic reason why. It's not a quota. It's that when you have more than one representative, people are casting more than one vote. They're considering more than one candidate. And in that environment, we have seen, like I have 3 House members in my state legislature in Maryland, and the House has far more women in it in percentage terms than the Senate, where there's only 1. And it's just because when there's more people, when people are spreading their votes around, they seem to be more ready to kind of consider different candidates. They're not necessarily thinking, I gotta elect a woman, but they're just ready to kind of see more. They're allowing more of themselves to be reflected politically. So just having multi-member districts tends to result in more women winning. And that's, something like my wife happens to work on that issue a lot, so she runs a group that focuses on it, and it's something that we think about. But it's not a direct necessary outcome, it's just a very likely outcome. But I think that when you see incredible distortions, like it was only a few years ago that the U.S. Senate, which represents the whole country and votes on every policy, they're not going to have a single African American in it. That was just like 6 years ago, and that says something about kind of how people see themselves represented in their government. And it doesn't mean that non-African Americans can't represent the interests of African Americans, but it's an indicator of a playing field that isn't kind of reflecting all of us. And I think a political system that's kind of responsive and almost sort of in a free market way, kind of reflective of energy, won't necessarily mean that you get 50% women, but you'll get more, and you'll get more kind of a reflection of our change in society.
So we have time for just 2 more questions. I saw one here, Michael, and one from you.
Hello. I might find you later and ask some Maryland-specific questions. But as far as general questions go, you said how the Democratic Party doesn't have any winner-take-all primaries. Now they used to. In 1972, Democratic primary in California, George McGovern finds himself in the mother of all ironies, having to argue in favor of a winner-take-all system in order to get the votes that he needs to get the nomination at that summer's convention. He, of course, is going up against the standard bearer for the old guard, liberal wing of the Democratic Party, Hubert Humphrey, who probably doesn't have much of a problem with winner-take-all systems generally, but has a big problem with it when it means possibly denying him the nomination after the California primary. This conflict of interest here between our goals and ideal, like our ideal system and rule book versus our ideal and desired policy outcomes and electoral outcomes. I'm interested in that whenever electoral reform is discussed, and would be interested to know, have you or anybody that you've worked with found yourself in a position where campaigning for electoral reform is one, maybe two steps away from more or less welcoming policy or electoral outcomes that you don't want?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I think that I really personally, kind of, and governed by a belief that a fuller debate about our issues in a more representative legislature, being able to represent people's opinion, will lead toward, in general, better policy outcomes over time, because we hear opinions. They get debated fairly. Ideally, if they're good opinions, they build support. People really want them. They ultimately get them. We can talk about issues that are important before the whole country thinks they're important. And if they really are important, then we all get to learn that they're important sooner than we do now. That kind of, that's my sort of general policy perspective. Tied to that is, certain things you can imagine I care about that we don't talk about as much as maybe we could. But I think certainly the way most of the legislators and elected officials that deal with this are much short-term calculations, very sort of tribal and, and very like what just happened in the last election and what might happen in the next election kind of thinkers. And that's true. There are sort of ones who aren't like that, and it's always sort of fun to deal with them. So you have to kind of work within those confines and have to sort of work within the limitations of what they're thinking, and it's often tricky. I think that in any given circumstance, one could say, if you use ranked choice voting in this election, the person I really like the most might end up losing because they are more likely to get 40% than 51% or something. But over time, I fully believe that allowing people to kind of be fully expressed is kind of better for us. So I'm comfortable with it, but certainly some of the people we work with are much more short-term in their thinking. Was there going to be one or two questions? Yeah.
Thank you for talking today. It was a very interesting lecture. Is that on? Oh, it's on there. So, in the past election, one thing I noticed was there was a very grassroots element, and I think to a certain extent, the Republicans picked up on this, but I think the Democrats dropped the ball on it. You saw Bernie Sanders, who was exceptionally more popular than Clinton, who, at least based on what I saw, and then he ended up not getting the nomination. And there was all, sorry for the pun, but there was a lot of politics in the background. I think he should have been running for the Democrats. He was far more popular. But the point is, I think when you look at this election, you especially start seeing this whole, the younger generation, and they're trying to change everything. But we are literally seeing that. I mean, you go on the internet for 5 seconds, political ideologies that people have never paid attention to are now starting to be, propagated in sort of more a mainstream way. And yet you saw this in this past election. That's why you sort of saw the alt-right becoming big. That's why, Trump gained a lot of popularity. That's why Sanders was popular. So, how do you think this will play a role in politics going forward? Do you think sort of the mainstream political structures are going to have to become more acute to like stuff on social media has an impact in real life, as we saw in this election? Do you think politicians are going to have to be more acute to that? How do you think that's going to change traditional political processes?
It's a good question. Well, I think it's sort of part of these patterns about why the conversation we're trying to encourage people to have is going to be just very, very timely, because things are changing. Like, genies are out of bottles, but it's sort of clashing with our rules. So you think of the Bernie Sanders force. In some ways, the Donald Trump force within the Republican Party. I mean, it was fascinating. They both won the New Hampshire primaries, and neither had ever run in a primary in that party ever before, right? And they suddenly are like the front runners, or at least doing quite well within these major party primaries. So, real outsiders being able to kind of burst in and created their own constituency, and not like Clinton kind of, rising up through, like very much within the party. There is a history of that in our country, of sort of outsiders. Barack Obama was kind of an outsider, but able to be an insider too. But I think the challenge is that it's like Sanders had never run as a Democrat before, because he always ran as an independent. So the logical thing, based on that history, it's not like he's a young man, right? So his whole life, he'd always run as a general election candidate, not as a Democrat or Republican. Now, why did he not do that for president? Because of our electoral system, right? It wasn't like suddenly he's like, oh, I'm really a Democrat. Oh, man, I just suddenly figured that out. It's he's not a Democrat now again, right? He re-registered as an independent. But he might run as a Democrat again in 2020. I wouldn't be surprised. But it's because the logical place for him to run doesn't work in our system. And if our system changed, it would. And other people too, right? Like John Kasich is obviously clearly not very happy with President Trump. Governor of Ohio, interesting guy, may try to run for president as independent. Who knows? May try to form a new party. But it'd be very challenging for him to do it within our system and not have a whole lot of people say, what are you doing? You're going to hand this to pro-choice Democrats and stuff. So I think the energy is going to be continually expressed, and our people are using social media, finding new candidates. And then let's channel it into the primaries. That's not a very satisfying answer. It is an answer, but it's not complete. And it left a lot of Sanders people sort of unhappy. And I think that's just one of many such situations we're going to keep seeing, and the kind of pressures that I think will ultimately lead us to just evolve our system with statutory changes, right? We're not talking about redoing the Constitution. We're just talking about adapting our rules to make our Constitution work. So, thank you.
I thank Rob very much. Let's thank him already. Just two brief comments. One is that there's a reception after this event immediately following in the Great Room, so please join us for that. And the other is an advertisement of an event which will happen next week, and in conjunction with this, we'll have a debate about the question, should majorities rule? A question that's very much related to this, because if we have a majoritarian voting system, then we should probably figure out first whether we even want that, or whether that's a good thing to have majorities rule. So I'm very pleased that Dr. Adam Myers and myself will be headliners in this debate, together with members of the Providence College debate team, Patrick Reynolds and Noah Gemma and others. And I'm very happy that we'll have that in conjunction with this. Thank you very much once again, Rob, for coming. And thank you very much for showing up this afternoon.